PNG performed in terms of meeting its external debt payments, especially with IMF and other multilateral institutions?
So, as I said, our financing is very cheap. It's and there's a long grace period. So, as soon as we begin lending, the country doesn't begin repaying anything back to the IMF for 5 years. And once it does begin paying back, it will be paying back at an interest rate of 2.8%. In terms of the country's meeting its external debt obligations, they haven't defaulted on any payment, and that's a credit to the government.
Now, what is PNG's current debt to GDP ratio based on the IMF's assessment?
So, based on official numbers, the country's debt to GDP ratio is around 50% of GDP. So it's not on the high end. If you compare it to other countries in the Asia Pacific region, it's not on the high end. It's not on the very low end. It sort of sits, not even in the middle. It sort of sits a bit on the lower end. So the country's debt is entirely sustainable. And if it wasn't sustainable, the IMF wouldn't be providing a financing program.
With the stagnation of wages, what can be done about it to improve the cost of living?
So that's a very important question, right? So people on the one hand talk about how the price level has been rising. And if you look at the actual data, it's been rising for many, many years, for over a decade now. I think you've asked a very important question. The question is, why hasn't household income not risen in line with the cost of living? And there's many reasons for that, but one significant reason for that is down to the fact that there have been FX shortages. What the FX shortages have done is they have significantly hampered investment spending, and they have significantly hampered the country's ability to attract foreign direct investment. Now, what does that mean? These FX shortages have essentially generated lower GDP growth. And what is the biggest determinant of driving wages and household income? It's essentially GDP growth. So if you can deal with the FX shortages, which is essentially a reflection of the fact that the kina is overvalued, you can make a more conducive business environment, which in turn will generate more investment, which in turn will generate more GDP growth, which in turn should hopefully push up wages and household income. The final point I'll make on this is that if you look at surveys of CEOs done in Papua New Guinea, they rank FX shortages as the single biggest impediment to their business growth in this country.
It's a good segue into our next question. To what extent do you engage or consult local interest groups, businesses, and other multilateral institutions?
So that's a very significant part of my role here, is to always speak to the key stakeholders on the ground, to speak to NGOs, to speak to the business community. Our work is not just with the government, so that's the first point I'll make. And it's very important that I get a sense of what the views are on the ground, so I can convey those views back to Washington, and that can help inform our policy advice. You know, Papua New Guinea hasn't had an IMF representative on the ground for over 20 years. I'm the first one in over 20 years. And I'm here precisely for that reason, to gauge and to listen and to see what people's concerns are, so I can relay more accurately and in real time those concerns back to Washington, D.C. That's the first point. The second point is, as I said, the IMF has never recommended devaluation. All we've asked for is to introduce greater exchange rate flexibility. And the other thing that we've called for is our policies to begin to remove the overvaluation in the exchange rate. Because it is this overvaluation in the exchange rate that is causing the FX shortages, which in turn dampens investment spending, which in turn reduces GDP growth, which in turn pushes down wages, which in turn leads to a cost of living crisis. So if we want to deal with the cost of living crisis, the question we have to ask ourselves is, how can we begin to push up wages? How can we begin to raise household incomes? And the only way we're going to do that is through investment and higher GDP growth, which will create more jobs, which in turn will push up household incomes. And the only way we're going to achieve that is to get rid of the FX shortages. How do we get rid of the FX shortages? We remove the kina overvaluation.